Hello and welcome to the course of U.S. history. I am your host, Mr. Samuelson. Last time we were together, we looked at the causes, key actions, and outcomes of the French and Indian War. One of those key outcomes is going to be the American Revolution, but we're not there yet. Now we're going to be looking at taxes and boycotts. This is one of the reactions to the French and Indian War. Because after the French and Indian War, Britain had to pay for it. You see, they'd borrowed a lot of money in order to pay for this war, and now they need to pay that money back. Their economy is not in great shape. So they've got to come up with some income. They need to come up with that money fast. And they're going to turn to the colonies as a potential source of this income. Now, another way that they do that, we'll get to the taxes in a minute, is to improve Native American relations. You see, if part of their money is going toward protecting their new land from Native Americans, Indians, whom they just fought a war against, well, they could save a lot of money by making sure that those Native Americans are much happier. And so they issue the Proclamation of 1763, which forbids Western settlement, opens up a huge Indian reserve, Indian land. And here we have the king believing that not only will this make the natives happier and therefore less likely to attack, but they can also earn income in the fur trade. It seems to be a win-win for the king. Now, the other half of this is going to wind up being taxes. Taxes are going to have to be raised because you still have to protect this land, particularly against the Spanish or from anybody else thinking they could seize it. And so the king needs taxes. More money for more of a military presence throughout the region. Now, the first tax that they are going to go for is in 1763, and it's Parliament that passes the Stamp Act. The Stamp Act basically says that most paper products moving around the colonies need to have a stamp placed onto them. So the colonists would purchase a stamp, and then they would place that stamp right on top of the seal that said it needed a stamp to be sold, and therefore the colonists would have paid a tax in order to purchase a good. It is the first direct taxation of the colonists. Now, 100 years before this wouldn't have been a big deal, but now the English have this established principle. It's within the English Bill of Rights, this idea of no taxation without representation. The Stamp Act is a violation of that principle, and the colonists definitely notice that. They definitely are angered, and they protest quite vigorously. The biggest protest of this is a colonial boycott of all goods requiring stamps. Now, all of a sudden, the colonists are actually going to get an ally in this. I'll get to that in a moment. Let's talk about the group that organized the boycott, though. Here we have the Sons of Liberty. The Sons of Liberty are a group in Boston. They're going to be the leaders of much of the boycotts and much of the pre-revolutionary activity in the colonies. The group will become famous throughout the colonies for its resistance to Britain, but do recall they are a New England, Massachusetts, Boston-based organization. Now, their protests are going to severely hurt British merchants. And it's the British merchants who trade in the colonies. And the British merchants actually wind up being an unwitting ally of the Sons of Liberty because they are going to protest to Parliament. They're going to say the Stamp Act is hurting our business. Please get rid of it. And Parliament does. They do get rid of that Stamp Act. However, it is not the last time that Parliament is going to tax the colonies. More taxes are coming. Now, let's take a quick moment. I want to talk about Sam Adams here. Samuel Adams is a very important historical figure who sometimes in modern society in particular is not necessarily remembered for what he is really important from. He makes his name as the leader of the Sons of Liberty, the protest organization against taxation, against the British as a whole. He also had an established position within the colonies as a brewer. So he's a merchant, he's a patriot. He will later become a member of Congress and a governor of Massachusetts. And today, Well, that's not what we tend to remember him from. Please do remember that he is an actual historical figure and of great importance. Now, he claims, and the people believe at this time, that Britain is a threat to American liberties. So he's one of the first people to go out there and say, hey, we are Americans, not Britain. And by the way, Britain is a threat to us as Americans. He's a leader in that patriot movement. Now, one of those moments that helps clarify the threat that Great Britain poses to the colonies is the Boston Massacre. This is a result of some pretty high tensions in Boston, due in no small part to the protests of Samuel Adams and his Sons of Liberty. What happens here is that the protesters have gotten so angry at the British that they have actually organized, well, not so much organized as just kind of collected into a mob to express their anger. And this mob gets a little bit rowdy. And at some point, they actually attack some British soldiers who are on duty. They're throwing snowballs, they're throwing rocks, they're throwing clubs at these British soldiers. And these British soldiers start to fear for their life, and they fire into the crowd. Now, the British soldiers kill those 5 people. The propaganda of the Sons of Liberty is that they attacked a peaceful crowd. It wasn't actually all that peaceful, but this really does get a lot of colonists angry and motivated and on the side of the Sons of Liberty. Side note of history, this individual right here, featured in this picture, his name is Crispus Attucks. He's an African-American living in Boston at the time, who is considered by many, and I would be one of them, to be the first victim of the Revolutionary War. Technically speaking, we're several years before the Revolution at this point, but here we have our first armed conflict, our first victims, our first people dying, and Crispus Attucks was that first victim. Now, this incident does go down in history as the Boston Massacre, a name that was circulated fairly quickly in order to turn the American people against the British. And boy, is it successful. Now, on the heels of the Boston Massacre, we have another action by the British that increases anger within the colonies. And again, specifically within Boston, we have the passage of the Tea Act. Now, the Tea Act was not actually meant as punishment for the colonies or even as a tax on the colonies. It simply was an agreement between the British government and the British East India Tea Company for the exclusive rights to trade tea in the colonies. That by itself was not meant to hurt anybody, it was just a deal worked out with this company. But the unintended effect was that the British East India Tea Company is going to hire their own dock workers, who will then set up shop in Boston and unload and load all of the British ships that come in. This is going to lead to unemployment amongst the Boston dock workers. And those Boston dock workers are going to be quite angry about it. So angry, in fact, that they are going to join the Sons of Liberty in a little tea party. Yes, the Boston Tea Party. The Sons of Liberty are going to dress up as Mohawk Indians and board these British East India Company ships and throw all of their tea into Boston Harbor. Britain does not look fondly upon this. We're going to get into that in the future. Next time, things are going to move to the brink of war, and we're going to look at the battles of Lexington and Concord and what the colonists will do after those little skirmishes. Thank you for joining me today for the course of U.S. history, and farewell.